Welcome back to part 4 in the video regarding the Israeli nerfing problem. In part 3 we were discussing super weapons and primary weapons on other decks. We gave examples to that effect, and we also talked about what are the requirements needed for any unit to be considered a super weapon or a primary weapon. And now we are finally here in the Israeli deck, and we are going to go over the Israeli deck piece by piece. At first I wanted to go over, examine and explain why none of the units in this deck can be considered a super weapon or a primary weapon, basically solidifying the claim in fact that the Israeli deck has no super weapons or primary weapons for that matter. But we are not going to do that. We might give a few examples, but we are not going to go in and explain the reasons why each unit cannot be regarded as such, because quite simply you can do it yourself. Just go over the previous video, and then after reviewing the criteria needed for a unit to be considered a super weapon or a primary weapon, you will find by yourself, without having any trouble at all, that none of the Israeli deck units fit the bill, and that none of the Israeli deck units live up to those requirements to be considered a primary weapon or a super weapon. Some lack the edge, some lack the cost effectiveness, some lack the availability, and some have deficiencies that overshadow and overcloud the unit's abilities. Now, that very same important factor that the Israeli deck has no super weapons or primary weapons is yet another substantial part of a far greater framework of deficiencies the Israeli deck is stricken by that prevents it from being a balanced and a playable nation as opposed to most other nations in the game. So what are we still going to do in this video, you may ask? Well, in this video we will be adding discussions about suggestions on what improvements are needed to be had for a unit or units in the Israeli deck to achieve super weapon status or primary weapon status, improvements that are most certainly needed to be made in this deck in terms of cost effectiveness, characteristics, changes in units, in order to bring this deck up to speed and in order to fix the imbalance and nerfing problem it contains. Also, we are going to give suggestions about what units are needed to be added to this deck without question, because adding them to this deck would be historically accurate, and also adding them could help to rectify the deficiency problem this deck is suffering from. Lastly, deck build-up fix to correct the problem of the Israeli deck slot design flaw, and of course the very much awaited recon tab. We are going to go over it unit by unit. We are going to do all this hopefully in this video. Our main goal here is to balance this deck out and enable it to be playable and balanced deck in 1 versus 1. And after we are done here, we are going to give a conclusion statement and hopefully get the active response and intervention from the game developers to finally balance this deck out for us. And if we could achieve that goal, that would be nothing short of justice that would be made to this deck, and a blessing to the balance factor in the game overall. Okay, but first, before we begin, I would really like to address some of the flack that I received about the China deck 65 points PTZ 89 vehicle. I've discussed the PTZ being a primary weapon in the previous video. Some guy commented on the video saying I have no clue what I'm talking about, so I want to put it to the test, and I'm going to show you a video of the PTZ in action face to face against a Magach 7C Gimel, which is the most powerful medium tank the Israeli deck can put to the field. Also, to address Razman's claim in his ranking every single Wargame Red Dragon unit helicopters video, where in his video he placed the Super Cobra super weapon helicopter and the Israeli Lahatut helicopter in the same bracket. Check minute 42 in his video. Basically, he made a scale in his video, a scale that's supposed to help players tell how good the unit is relative to all other units. So I want to understand how could he possibly put those two units in the same bracket, because one is a super weapon and the other is a useless piece of crap. I'm going to start with the PTZ. I have prepared a short video. Let's go over to it now. The PTZ is supposed to be used as a tank destroyer, hiding in cover, making ambushes with its powerful super heavy tank gun. It is not meant or designed to be used as a main battle tank because that would most certainly put it at a disadvantage. It is not meant to be used that way. It is not meant to be out in the open. Now, the guy who made the comment that I have no clue what I'm talking about said that the PTZ is a glass tank that cannot win against the Magach 7C Gimel at any engagement, and that would most certainly and most probably need 4 direct hits to kill the Magach 7C Gimel, while the Magach 7C Gimel would most certainly kill the PTZ glass tank from a single hit. Now, when I'm talking in my videos, I know exactly what I'm talking about because I've tested the Israeli deck in combat from top to bottom. I know everything that there is to know about this deck, so I wanted to show this guy that even when the PTZ is placed at the disadvantage and coming face to face with the Magach 7C Gimel in the open, not even when the PTZ is used in the manner that it is supposed to be used for it to exploit its full potential, having the two meet and come face to face as standalone units that encounter one another. I wanted to show him that the PTZ 65 points vehicle will still destroy the 95 points Magach 7C Gimel, just as I predicted, because the size of the gun and the AP power of the PTZ cannot be matched by the Magach 7C, and even when the Magach 7C has 17 frontal armor, that would not save it against the PTZ, having only 5 frontal armor but a better gun.
下命令吧，长官。是，团长同志。
So again, both tanks full HP encountering one another one-on-one. We saw that both tanks were destroyed. They destroyed each other. But when you check the stats, you may find that on paper the Magach 7C Gimel gives the false impression of being a better unit because it has a better optics than the PTZ. It has medium optics while the PTZ has only poor optics. So the Magach is supposed to spot the PTZ and fire first. And again, you can clearly see that the Magach 7C Gimel costs a lot more, 95 points, as opposed to the PTZ only 65 points. But when confronted face to face in battle, the PTZ has the edge, and it is more likely to destroy the Magach 7C Gimel than the other way around, because the gun it uses is very overpowering, and in most cases it could even disable vital critical component on the Magach 7C Gimel for the on the first hit, rendering the Magach unable to sustain its combat effectiveness and return fire. Okay, now let's talk about the Super Cobra and the Latut. The Latut is a worthless unit because of the delivery system it uses, the Mapats. The Mapats is one of the weakest and poor, if not the worst, fire delivery system for an ATGM missiles in this game. So out of the 4 missiles it carries, it is more likely to miss all 4 of them, or at least miss more than it makes hits. The real accuracy on it is shameful, and even when it makes hits, it is most likely not to inflict enough damage, not even enough to make a kill against a 60-point tank. It will need a couple or even more to kill a 60-point tank, so nothing special there. It's worthless. So do not be deceived by the stats of 60% accuracy and high AP power, because when you test it in battle, you are sure to find out by yourself that this is not a combat efficient unit, none whatsoever, and it is almost completely useless. Again, not combat effective at the slightest. Whenever you see that delivery system on any unit, you can regard that unit as a very weak threat, if any. Now, on the other hand, we got the Super Cobra. As mentioned before, it is a very powerful super weapon unit. It will destroy anti-air units using radar with its seed missiles. it is also very likely to hit its mark with all of the 8 missiles it carries, killing each tank one at a time by a single hit. It carries a bigger payload, has more vast array of weapons in its arsenal to deal with the multitude of targets it may encounter, and in practice it has a better accuracy, better delivery system. It is a very combat efficient unit. So again, I really want you guys to understand that don't take anything and everything you see in Razman's videos or on any other people's rant videos about the Israeli deck suggesting the Israeli deck is powerful. Don't accept anything and everything at face value. Go and check for yourselves before you make judgments about this deck. The best way to know if this deck is a very weak deck or not is to test it for yourselves against an opponent that is relatively at the same level as you. That way and that way alone can you find for yourselves and test for yourselves and recognize for yourselves the abilities or disabilities each and every unit on this deck has. And may I add, when it comes to this deck, I am like Samuel L. Jackson in Pulp Fiction. I'm the foot fucking master, so to speak. So I've been playing this deck for over 5 years, so I know what I'm talking about. Okay, we are here in the Israeli deck. The best way to address the imperative changes that would have to be made to balance this deck out is by trying to build a deck, and along the way highlight the deficiencies we have already discussed in the previous videos and point out the ways of fixing them by recommending the required changes. Let's start by the logistics tab, but note that we are not going to go over the deck in a chronological order, but rather in a Star Wars Master Yoda speech order. And that is because by doing so it will help you, the viewers, get a more coherent understanding of how things come together. And by doing so it will help you, the viewers, understand the big picture, so to speak, more clearly, and how the puzzle pieces fall into place when it comes to Israeli decks. The logistics tab, you got the Hapak. It is a command infantry, same as in any other deck. It comes as in a variant of infantry carriers, nothing too special there. Using it with the Merkava 2A is also not too great, and you would probably wish to avoid using that combination because, as said before, the Merkava 2A is not cost effective enough to be considered a real bargain. It is a very costly unit, and while considering command infantry, you always wanted to be delivered fast and cheap to the field. Only thing that is really worth mentioning in the logistics tab is the Achzarit Pikud. And even that unit is not too great because, considering what you are getting for 130 points, it is not cost effective. In close inspection, this unit is not too special at all. It has no weapons on it, none whatsoever, and it is only good for one thing, taking a bit more punishment before it dies. You can use it if you want to make sure your command unit would be a bit more survivable when confronted with artillery fire and such. This is if your command unit is in a somewhat obvious place on the map, but make a note of the fact that some of the other nations have command tanks that cost less than the Achzarit Pikud. They cost 120 points, or the same, they cost 130 points. So on other decks, for the same price or less, you can get an armored vehicle unit that can serve as a command unit and can even be combat effective to some degree, being more survivable than the traditional spit on it and it dies command unit. Okay, what else? You got a forward operating base, FOB, in short. Let's be fair before we move on. The supply units in the Israeli deck logistics tab are very good, so at least there is no deficiency there. You got a lot of good options to you. You got the Asur, which is a great unit. You got the Hoshkosh, which is great. And so to sum it up and to conclude, the Israeli deck logistics tab is not too special, but it does provide good options, and it is not stricken by major deficiencies. Thank God for small favors. Alright, let's move on to the infantry tab. Now let's talk about the infantry tab. There are many types of infantry units in the game, a lot of classes, but it all comes down to 3 main categories in any infantry tab. Basically, you got what I like to call the simple tree. Each infantry unit in the game presented wherever in the game, in whatever infantry tab in the game. Each infantry unit can be associated to be in one of the three main categories, three departments. 1. Combat effective, 2. Auxiliary support, and 3. Almost useless. And when you examine each and every infantry unit in the game, it is fairly easy to recognize which is which and where each unit examined belongs to. Again, three types of department, and each infantry unit can be associated to be in one out of the three of those very same department types. Let's consider the two departments types you cannot afford to load onto your deck out of the three when using the Israeli deck. And justly so, because you only have 5 slots, you cannot afford to load almost useless units. That is self-explanatory. But when using the Israeli deck, you cannot even afford to load auxiliary units support. And that is because the use of auxiliary units, support auxiliary units in the Israeli deck, infantry tab would lead and leave you with major deficiencies. For example, in availability when using the Merkava 2A, and lack of key weapons when using the Messiah and the Milui. I will explain, we are going to go into that in detail, but first let's specify what is the basic function of the infantry in your deck, the principle behind it, what roles you are supposed to have available to you in combat using infantry when playing the Israeli deck. Again, traditional roles using infantry units that you must fulfill playing this deck. Well, there are 5 major key roles that fit perfectly to the 5 slots you have available to you in your deck. Those roles are regular infantry, shock infantry, ATGM team, commando team, and anti-air infantry. First role, regular infantry, is your cannon fodder. It should also be used to spread your presence around the map. They are cheap, they have good availability, so they can be used in less critical positions, closing gaps and holes around the map. Basically, they are your paintbrush to cover vast areas on the map with your army's banner. Okay, the second role, shock infantry. The role of the shock infantry is to be, how shall we say, more to the point answer against enemy infantry units. They are a better answer for the role of holding positions and in towns than regular infantry. So it is like having reinforced regular infantry in the key positions in order for you to turn the tide where tough fighting is expected and required to take place. Third role is ATGM team. It is self-explanatory, to kill tanks and armored units from long distances. Fourth role is commando team. Make use of the commando team to make special operations, infiltrating weak spots in the enemy line, to conduct guerrilla warfare, and to be able to counter heavy tanks from close range. And lastly, fifth role, the anti-air infantry role. It is there for you to be able to protect your units from helicopters in the places where armored anti-air units cannot find cover, like towns, and also to set ambushes for enemy helicopters in tough terrain settings. Okay, that is a small summation of the key roles needed to be met by your infantry tab using the Israeli deck. Now, when examining the Israeli infantry tab, in the useless units department you got the Bazak and Gavnuni. In the auxiliary support department you got the Miluim, the Merkava 2A with infantry and the Messiah. And in the combat effective department you got the units we are going to pick to occupy the empty slots in our deck to fill the 5 major key roles we have just mentioned. Now this part is very important. While not taking useless units into our deck is self-explanatory, it is important to note why you cannot afford to take auxiliary support infantry units like the Miluim, Merkava 2A and Messiah onto your deck when playing the Israeli faction. So let's go over the auxiliary support type infantry units one by one and explain why you cannot consider them as a viable option to be uploaded onto your deck. Again, auxiliary support consists of Miluim, Merkava 2A and Messiah. So let's start from the Merkava 2A. with infantry and explain why it is not a viable choice. The Merkava 2A with infantry, it is a very decent unit. It can support infantry very well, but the price of it for you getting it into the battlefield is tremendously high considering the cost effectiveness dynamics in 1 versus 1. 90 points for the tank and another extra 10 to 15 points for the infantry. So the minimum price is 100 points. Also, when using it, you cut down the availability number of the regular infantry unit occupying it by more than half. So without the tank you can get 22 per card, but if you are using the tank you only get 9 per card, which is understandable because you cannot afford to have 22 tank cards of that type. But as mentioned before in the previous videos, availability factor when using regular infantry is very important. It is an important factor in 1 versus 1, and so you wouldn't want to limit your regular infantry numbers when playing 1 versus 1. I think the best solution in this case is to exclude this unit completely from the infantry tab, making it available as a standalone tank in the tank tab, like the Nana Yon Shiki G in the Blue Dragons Coalition deck that we have discussed in the previous video. Again, to make it a standalone tank for a price of 80 points, basically use it to completely replace the Merkava 2B, add cannon shells to it so it will have more than 9 rounds, and by doing so you will effectively create a primary weapon in the Israeli deck. A primary weapon this deck does not yet possess for a reasonable price, and by doing so this unit will become a somewhat cost-effective unit with a good edge. Another solution to consider is just to lower the price of getting it with infantry in the infantry tab for a new price of 85 points instead of 100 or 105. That would certainly make it a much more viable option, and you will be much more inclined of trying using it because the price will be much more appealing, and it would make up for causing the availability deficiency by picking it to occupy one of the slots in the infantry tab. Okay, let's go over to the Miluim. The Miluim are militia auxiliary force. The reason you would not take them is because firstly they are slow as a snail. Once you unload them anywhere on the map, they are practically stuck there for the duration of the battle. They are not very versatile. Movement speed is very low on them. Secondly, they are not too much of a combat effective unit. They cannot defend themselves good. They can be easily overpowered and stunned by anything that comes across their path. And thirdly, as I just said, you would want to fill each and every single slot in the infantry tab with traditional units to fill the traditional key roles, and you don't have enough slots to consider auxiliary units when using the Israeli tab. It is also true that other than auxiliary units like the Miluim, which are militia, when using the Israeli deck infantry tab, you cannot afford to use any support units like the Merkava 2A in its current state, and now getting into the Masayat. And why you cannot pick the Masayat? Same problem, because they also can impair your ability to fill all of the traditional key roles needed to be filled using the infantry tab. The Masayat are a very good support unit, but using them, as I just said, will force you to give up one of the infantry units that are augmenting one of the key roles in your deck that you certainly cannot afford to lose when playing the Israeli deck. So to sum it up, you can fix all of the problems in the infantry tab if you add one single empty slot to the Israeli infantry tab and adding 5 extra armory points to it. By doing so, you will effectively give this deck the option to use at least one extra unit. You will be able to pick an auxiliary force like militia to accompany your 5 indispensable key role infantry units, or a different path. You can take a different path and pick one support unit like the Merkava 2A or the Masayat to go along with your 5 indispensable key role units. So again, by adding an extra slot and 5 extra armory points, you have effectively solved the deficiency slot design flaw problem in the Israeli infantry tab. This is just another solution to consider. Now let's move over to the tank tab. But oh, I almost forgot. In order to better the balance and give solution to the big deficiency problem, the Israeli deck troop carriers being weak, slow and non-mobile, and also to fix the problem of them being inferior to all other deck troop carriers, the price of the Achzarit should be reduced to 10 points, same as the Nagmachon, to give better balance, to compensate for the lack of key weapons, not having autocannon, same as all other deck troop carriers. So reducing the price of the Achzarit to 10 points instead of its current price for 15 points will enable players using the Israeli deck to counter the deficiency facing enemy troop carriers by at least having more resilient troop carriers. And by that I mean having the Achzarit at a more reasonable price will enable the player using the Israeli deck to consider the Achzarit a troop carrier of choice, to notify that disadvantage of being overpowered by a far superior enemy troop carriers with autoguns, better mobility and speed. As things stand now, the Achzarit costs just way too much to be considered a viable choice, and lest we forget that the enemy troop carriers are still superior in every way to the Achzarit, so getting it for 5 less points than it is now still leaves you at a deficiency against the enemy troop carriers, but it will yield a far more balanced engagement because what you lack in firepower facing the enemy troop carriers, you will compensate for it by your troop carriers' survivability. Alright, let's go over to the tank tab. The Israeli tank tab, let's make it short and simple. The Israeli tanks have the lowest AP power in the game and lowest caliber guns in the game. Let's consider the historical irony here. When keeping in tradition with historical accuracy, the Israeli tanks should all have max range to them, because all of the Israeli tank crews have always been trained above and beyond to enable them to engage enemies from far greater ranges when facing any enemy on the battlefield. Tanks in the Israeli nation were always modified to the extent of allowing them to perform above and beyond their core design. Now, when we are referring to the tanks in the Israeli tank tab, having those tanks with the weakest AP power in the game compared to other nations and the lowest caliber guns compared to other nations in the game, at least having the range advantage is necessary to balance their inferiority in 1 versus 1 battles. The problem the Israeli deck has is like a big knot that is entangled, and problems that are entangled, tied together. So you need to untangle the deficiency problem in one way or another. You can't have it both ways and fix all of the problems, because that may give this deck too much power and we don't want to do that. So either you give the Israeli tanks cost effectiveness and max range to all of their main battle tanks, so having the weakest guns and the lowest caliber guns in the game, at least you will have on your tanks the ability to target enemies from a greater range, and cost effectiveness on their super heavy tanks. Say like making the Baz work 170 points, and the Merkava 3B be worth I don't know, 140 points. Or either you give this deck a better way of defending those tanks with a long-range anti-air defense system. Right now this deck houses all of the problems and it does not catch a break from any of them. So if you give this deck a good air defense system like the Patriot, you will also make the use of the Baz super heavy tank. The cost of it, you will make it worthwhile. You will be much more obliged to use it in battle without having to babysit it too much or being afraid of that tank being swat down from the skies too damn fast at any given moment. So again, there are 3 ways to fix and solve the Israeli tank tab deficiency. The game developers can pick one of the 3 ways in order to fix the tank tab deficiency. 1. Give all of the Israeli medium tanks max range of 2,237 meters to compensate for having the weakest AP power guns with lowest caliber guns in the game. 2. make the super heavy tanks and some of the medium tanks far more cost effective, lowering the price bar of all of the medium tanks by 5 points and the super heavy tanks by 15 points. And 3, and most simple solution, is to just give this deck the Patriot air defensive system, having all of the tanks remain the way that they are right now. So having the deficiency in the tank tab will not be directly fixed, but it will be fixed indirectly by support given to the tanks, allowing the player to be much more obliged to make use of the super heavy tanks that reside in the Israeli tank tab. Alright, let's go over to the support tab. We have already discussed it linked in previous videos. We have already discussed what will our weapons of choice be in the anti-air department, considering the current state the Israeli support tab is in. Basically, we talked about the long-range anti-air deficiency problem and the units that we are most likely to pick for the role of anti-air defense: the Machbet, the Chaparral, and the BTR. We are going to get into mortars, MLRS, and artillery choices in a minute, but first let's finish up the discussion about the Patriot and explain why it should be added to this deck without question. The Patriot anti-air system was in use in Israel from the early 90s, so it will be historically accurate and only fair to include and incorporate that firing system to the Israeli deck to overcome the deficiency the deck has regarding its mediocre long-range anti-air abilities problem. There is really no good reason to prolong discussion about this unit. We can sum it up right away and name the reasons for its incorporation in this deck. The main reasons are: 1, it will solve the tank tab deficiency problem indirectly, but still it will solve it. I mean, it won't make your tank stronger, but it will help the user of this deck to be more inclined of using the super heavy tanks. 2, adding it will be historically accurate, as I just mentioned. 3, it will solve the problem with the long-range anti-air deficiency problem, because the Israeli deck has no answer to this deficiency problem as of yet, as opposed to all other nation decks in the game who do not share that deficiency problem. And finally, it will completely help to tie up significant number of balance issues and introduce a good balance to this deck and on a number of levels. Single-handedly, so to speak, it will almost solve all of the imbalance problems this deck contains within itself in its current state. Okay, now let's go over mortars, MLRS, and artillery choices. As mentioned in previous videos, the MLRS type RT unit Israel is using, the MAR 240 and the LAR 160, can be very effective in 10 versus 10, where you can rely on other players' FOBs and use the other players' FOBs to your advantage. You can use the MLRS's vast dispersion to hit multitude of targets, and you are very likely to hit targets and cause damage well enough to justify the cost of using them, because there are a lot of units spread around the map playing 10 versus 10. But again, in 1 versus 1 they are very likely to be less effective because there are not too many units around, and the crazy rate of supply consumption will most likely to deplete your supply fob rather quickly. So again, they can be effective to some degree, but using them in 1 versus 1 instead of other more traditional artillery pieces is very ill-advised. The MAR 290, on the other hand, is a very good unit, and you can even consider using it as your primary artillery weapon. The reload rate is very slow, so it won't be an ideal artillery unit, because the response time you get out of it is lacking a great deal, but once it fires it can do a lot of damage, while providing your enemy is still at the target location that you have specified, because again, it takes time for that unit to reload and open fire. Now, besides the MLRS, you got a lot of normal, average, decent and respectable RT choices. Nothing too special, but well enough to fulfill the role of a main artillery unit. No deficiency there in the artillery department. This is also true when using the mortars, the Laish and the Mahmat. That's it for now. In the next video we are going to finish up by going over the air support tab, vehicles tab and recon tab, give summation statement, and that's it. I will do my best to expedite the release of the next video, so please be patient, and until then, good luck on the battlefield, commanders. Karagov signing off.